Imagine for a second that you're just heading down to your local grocery store.
Okay.
You've got your standard shopping list, right?
Yeah.
A gallon of milk, maybe a loaf of bread, a few apples.
The essentials.
Exactly. But instead of reaching into your pocket for a slim leather wallet or, pulling out your phone to just casually tap against a digital register.
Which is what we all do now.
Right. But instead of that, you are dragging a solid carved stone disc. And this thing weighs exactly 3.75 tons.
Which is just a massive boulder.
It's a literal boulder. You're physically hauling this immovable boulder down the street. You're probably enlisting the help of several neighbors or maybe a whole team of draft animals just to pay for your weekly groceries.
It sounds completely absurd.
It does. It feels like this surrealist thought experiment.
Yeah.
But that is the literal reality of the rye stone.
The world's heaviest historical currency.
Exactly. Used on the island of Yap in the Pacific. And I really want you, the listener, to hold on to that specific, just staggering image of dragging a boulder to buy bread.
Because it completely shatters our preconceptions.
Right. It shatters these deeply ingrained, almost invisible ideas we walk around with every single day regarding what money actually is.
Yeah, it forces a total recalibration of the whole concept. Because when you picture a 3.5-ton stone operating as a unit of currency, the illusion of money as this static, natural law just begins to dissolve.
It totally evaporates.
You realize instantly that money is not just a piece of paper. It's not a circular piece of metal or a plastic card. It is a fluid, incredibly adaptable, and constantly evolving technology.
Technology.
And more importantly, it's a technology built entirely on the fragile foundation of human psychology. It's collective imagination. It's mutual agreement.
It only works because we all decide it works.
Exactly. It operates strictly on trust.
And when you pull back to look at the sheer unfathomable scale of this collective psychological agreement functioning in the modern world today, the numbers are genuinely staggering.
You really are.
We are diving into the data today from the visual guide, How Money Works. And the overarching statistics paint a wild picture. Right now, there's an estimated $80.9 trillion of broad money in existence across the globe.
80.9 trillion.
It's a number so large, the human brain actually struggles to visualize it. I mean, try picturing that.
You can't. It's too abstract.
And yet the disparities and the contradictions within that massive system are profound. According to the source material, 10% of the global population currently lives on less than $1.90 a day.
Which is just a brutal reality.
Furthermore, there are 2.5 billion adults walking the planet right now who do not even possess a basic bank account.
2.5 billion.
They are entirely unbanked. They're operating completely outside the formalized financial infrastructure that dictates global policy.
And the polarization embedded in those statistics is really the defining characteristic of the modern global economy.
How so?
Well, on one end of the spectrum, you have this massive segment of humanity, billions of individuals navigating their daily survival entirely decoupled from traditional banking mechanisms.
Right.
And then on the complete opposite end, just hovering above the entire system, you have an estimated $21 trillion thought to be quietly hidden away in complex overseas tax havens.
21 trillion, just hidden.
Yeah. It reveals a global architecture that is simultaneously ubiquitous, deeply entrenched in our daily survival, yet astonishingly abstract and opaque.
Which sets the perfect trajectory for our mission in today's deep dive.
Absolutely.
We are taking this source material, How Money Works, and we are going to meticulously map the DNA of money. The goal is to demystify the entire system operating behind the curtain of your bank app.
We're taking it all apart.
Right. We're going to trace the evolutionary timeline, from humans bartering literal livestock in muddy fields to the current era of swiping microchipped plastic.
And we'll examine the massive historical blunders, too.
Oh, the blunders are the best part. Where modern economies learned, often the hard way, how to attempt to control this chaotic, abstract force.
And finally, we're going to lift the hood on corporate accounting.
Yes, we'll look at how the largest mega corporations in the world actually measure their wealth, how they navigate cash flow, and how they, well, occasionally manipulate the numbers to maintain the illusion of endless growth.
Because understanding that architecture is essential, we are all subject to its rules. While the act of paying rent or purchasing a coffee feels like interacting with a fixed, immutable law of physics, The historical reality is that the financial system is anything but fixed.
It's an invention.
Exactly. It's a series of behavioral experiments, adaptations, and crisis responses that have compounded over thousands of years.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's wind the clock all the way back to the origin of those experiments. We're looking at the period roughly between 10,000 and 3000 BCE.
Way back.
Way back. Long before the concept of a bank vault, before the minting of coins, before the abstract concept of a price tag, there was barter.
The literal physical exchange of one useful good for another.
Right. You have a cow, I have a field of wheat. We both assess our needs, we meet, and we swap.
Simple enough on paper.
Adam Smith, the famous 18th century philosopher and economist, identified this specific interaction as the absolute fundamental precursor to the concept of money. But operating a society entirely on direct physical exchange introduces massive systemic friction.
And that friction is the catalyst for all subsequent financial innovation. I mean, barter is incredibly effective in very small, hyper-localized, tribal, or agrarian settings.
Sure, when everyone knows everyone.
Right. It forces face-to-face interaction and builds incredibly strong, interdependent trading relationships. You don't have to put your faith in the abstract value of a third-party currency issued by some distant king.
You're dealing exclusively in physical goods that possess intrinsic, immediate, practical utility. You can eat the wheat, you can milk the cow.
Exactly. But scaling that system reveals a critical structural flaw, which economists formally refer to as the double coincidence of wants.
The double coincidence of
No.
wants. So I have to actively desire your specific harvest of wheat, and you must simultaneously have an immediate need for my specific cow.
Which is a huge hurdle.
Right, because what if you happen to be a vegetarian? Or what if you already have 3 cows? My asset is completely worthless to you in that moment,
The trade grinds to a halt.
and I can't acquire the wheat I need to feed my family.
The required alignment of desires is a massive barrier. And the friction compounds when you factor in the realities of timing and divisibility.
Okay, timing, like the agricultural calendar.
Right. Perhaps we reach a verbal agreement, but your wheat is still in the ground. It won't be ready to harvest for another 3 months.
And I need to eat today.
Exactly. Or consider the value disparity. A mature, healthy cow represents a massive concentration of caloric and labor value, far more value than the small basket of wheat I might need from you today to bake bread.
And you can't exactly chop a living cow in half to make exact change.
Yeah. No, you can't. The moment you divide that specific asset, it loses its long-term utility and value. It's dead meat instead of a living, milk-producing animal.
So attempting to facilitate macroeconomic trade under these conditions is a logistical impossibility.
Moving a single goat to the neighboring village for a trade is a Tuesday afternoon chore.
But attempting to coordinate the movement of 1,000 goats across hundreds of miles to settle a regional trade dispute.
Or acquire building materials. It's an absolute nightmare of logistics, feed, and mortality rates.
So humanity hit a hard ceiling on what barter could accomplish, which forced the invention of the IOU.
The conceptual leap that changes everything.
Right. Because your wheat is still growing in the summer sun, I hand over my cow to you right now. In return, you give me a recorded IOU, a physical marker promising that you will deliver a set amount of wheat to me in the winter when the harvest comes in.
And the real leap happens when those IOUs stop being held in pockets and start circulating.
Circulating. So I hold your promise for winter wheat, but suddenly I need to repair my roof. I go to the local carpenter, and instead of giving him a cow or waiting for the wheat, I trade him your IOU.
That circulation is the genesis of formalized currency. The IOU ceases to be a localized, personal promise strictly binding you and the wheat farmer. It detaches from the individuals and takes on an independent life.
It becomes its own thing.
It begins performing the exact macroeconomic function of money, acting as a universal, transferable vessel of agreed-upon value. However, the source material is very specific about the threshold this vessel must cross.
Because an IOU on a scrap of bark isn't quite money yet.
Right. To elevate from a casual, localized IOU into what an economy formally recognizes and trusts as money, the instrument must possess 6 distinct characteristics.
Okay, let's break down those 6 requirements because it shows exactly why a cow fails as currency. First, it must be durable.
It can't rot in a warehouse, expire, or die of old age.
Second, it must be portable. It has to be of a practical size and weight to carry, conceal, and transport over long distances without a team of oxen.
Hence the rye stone problem.
Exactly. Third, it must be uniform. Every single unit of this money must be functionally identical to the next, so nobody has to spend time evaluating the specific quality of the coin they are handed.
Right, a dollar is a dollar.
Fourth, it must be easily divisible, allowing individuals to make precise change for transactions of wildly varying sizes. Fifth, it has to exist in a strictly limited supply.
Because if anyone can just walk outside and pick more of it off a tree, it loses its purchasing power instantly.
And sixth, it must be widely accepted across a large population as a standard means of exchange.
Looking at those 6 pillars, durability, portability, uniformity, divisibility, limited supply, and wide acceptance, it reveals the invisible architecture holding the entire concept together.
And what's underneath all of that?
The bedrock underlying all 6 of those physical characteristics is a purely psychological phenomenon: trust. A currency functions solely because the individual accepting it possesses unwavering confidence that at some point in the future, they can hand that exact same token to a complete stranger, and that stranger will honor its value in exchange for real physical goods or labor.
If that confidence wavers even slightly, the currency collapses back into a useless object.
It's just paper or metal again.
The timeline of bizarre historical artifacts that humans have collectively chosen to project that trust onto is just a fascinating study in behavioral economics. I mean, we immediately think of gold bars and silver coins, but the historical record is much stranger.
Much stranger.
Across vast stretches of India, Africa, and the South Pacific, expansive trade networks operated entirely on the exchange of cowrie shells.
Shells.
Yeah, these small, brightly colored seashells. And they functioned beautifully because they were naturally uniform, durable, and limited in supply, depending on your proximity to the ocean.
And going back even further, around 7000 BCE in ancient Sumeria, the agrarian bureaucracy relied on scribes using soft clay to create cuneiform tablets.
Writing in mud, basically.
Right. They would press wedge-shaped marks into the clay to record grain deposits or livestock transfers. Once the clay baked hard in the sun, that single tablet functioned simultaneously as a ledger receipt and a transferable unit of currency.
So from clay tablets and shells, we eventually get to the formalization of minted currency. And the source says this occurs in Lydia, an Iron Age kingdom located in what is now modern-day Turkey, around 650 BCE.
The Lydians solved the uniformity and trust problem.
How'd they do it?
They took electrum, which is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, smelted it into uniform, standardized discs, and stamped them with official state insignias like the head of a lion.
The first official government-backed coins.
Exactly. The critical innovation here was the fusion of intrinsic value and state authority. The precious metal itself held value, but the official stamp acted as a guarantee of weight and purity, which drastically reduced the friction of trade.
Because you no longer had to weigh and assay every piece of silver.
You simply trusted the stamp. And this model exploded globally. We see the rise of Athenian silver drachmas, the massive proliferation of Roman denarii bearing the profile of the reigning emperor to project authority.
And over in China, the Han Dynasty casting bronze coins with those distinctive square holes punched through the center.
Right, which was genius because it allowed merchants to string thousands of them together for bulk transport.
It really is the physical evolution of trust, moving from natural objects to state-sanctioned metal. But the source introduces a profound sociological perspective on what this physical shift did to the human mind.
It cites Georg Simmel.
Yes, a prominent German sociologist. He published a massive foundational text in 1900 called The Philosophy of Money. Simmel wasn't looking at the math, he was looking at the psychological reprogramming caused by the introduction of currency.
Simmel's analysis is vital for understanding modern society. He examined the social structure prior to the widespread integration of standardized money.
In those barter-based societies.
Right, or highly localized feudal societies. In those environments, the concept of value was incredibly subjective. It was messy and deeply entangled with personal identity.
How so?
If you were trading within a village, the value of an object or a service was often assessed through deeply incompatible qualitative systems. It was based on personal honor, traditional social hierarchies, the perceived physical exertion required to produce the good, or familial obligations.
So your ability to trade depended entirely on who you knew and your standing in the community.
Exactly. But what standard circulating money did, according to Simmel, was ruthlessly slice through all of those subjective personal ties. It introduced a cold, rational, purely quantitative system of value.
It replaced community obligation with pure mathematics.
Yes.
If you possess the required amount of currency, you suddenly have the freedom of choice and participation, entirely regardless of your family name, your social class, or your personal relationships with the local merchants.
It was a massive democratizing force. But it also fundamentally detached human interaction from personal connection, rationalizing and anonymizing trade.
That abstraction of value, detaching the purchasing power from the physical bulk of the precious metal, only accelerated over the centuries. As global trade expanded between the 1100s and the modern era, carrying heavy chests of silver coins across oceans or bandit-filled roads became a lethal liability,
A complete logistical nightmare.
which necessitated the jump to paper. The source marks a major milestone in 1661, when states and formalized banks began issuing paper banknotes.
And these slips of paper were essentially institutional IOUs.
Right, they held zero intrinsic value.
None. But they circulated based on the ironclad promise that the bearer could, at any time, walk into the issuing bank and exchange the paper back for its equivalent weight in actual physical gold or silver coins.
This required a monumental leap of societal trust.
Absolutely monumental.
But maintaining that trust was a constant battle against human ingenuity and fraud. Which brings up a fascinating historical tangent involving one of the greatest scientific minds in human history.
Isaac Newton.
Yes. During the late 1600s in England, the currency system was facing an existential crisis. The silver coins in circulation were being systematically destroyed by the public through a practice called clipping.
Clipping.
People would take a standard coin, use shears to snip off tiny slivers of silver from the edges, and then spend the slightly smaller coin at its full face value.
And then they'd melt down all the hoarded clippings and sell the raw silver.
Exactly. The coins in circulation became smaller, lighter, and completely lost their standardized trust. The British government was in a panic, and they actually brought in Sir Isaac Newton, taking him away from physics, and appointed him as the warden and later master of the Royal Mint to fix the crisis.
Newton approached the currency like a mathematical puzzle. He oversaw the massive recall and reminting of all the currency in the country, and he introduced a brilliant physical security feature, milling.
Milling, right.
He added those tiny uniform ridges around the extreme outer edge of the coin. If a coin was clipped, the ridges were destroyed, making the fraud instantly visible to anyone.
He literally engineered trust back into the physical artifact of money.
And that technological arms race to secure trust eventually transcended physical artifacts entirely. The leap from gold-backed paper to the system we operate in today is the final, ultimate abstraction.
Because the data shows that today, a staggering 92% of all global currency is strictly digital.
92%.
It doesn't exist in any physical vault. It is purely virtual data residing on servers maintained by central and commercial banks. Massive macroeconomic transactions representing billions of dollars occur in milliseconds, altering database ledgers without a single physical atom of a banknote changing hands.
Which paves the way for the ultimate detachment from the state, cryptocurrency.
Right. The source notes that by 2016, there are roughly 16 billion individual bitcoins in circulation, representing a collective market value of about $9 billion at the time.
The physical artifact of money, the cow, the shell, the stamped gold, the paper note has vanished entirely into decentralized cryptographic code.
The physical form has vanished, but the macroeconomic consequences of mismanaging the supply of that invisible value have absolutely not.
No, they haven't. In fact, as the mechanisms of money became more abstract and complex, the fallout from misunderstanding how it interacts with the real-world production of goods became catastrophic.
And the collateral damage of these historical miscalculations is what directly necessitated the invention of economics as a formalized academic discipline.
This transitions us directly into the era where bad monetary policy literally broke the world.
To fully grasp this, we have to examine the actions of King Henry VIII of England in the year 1542.
The king was engaged in expensive foreign wars. He was maintaining a lavish court and rapidly running out of money.
And instead of cutting spending or raising deeply unpopular taxes, he decided to manipulate the currency itself. She orchestrated a massive, covert operation known to history as the Great Debasement.
The Great Debasement.
He ordered the mints to systematically reduce the precious metal content of the standard English silver penny. Over a few years, the coins went from being pure sterling silver to being roughly 3/4 cheap base metals, primarily copper, simply covered in a thin silver wash.
He believed he had discovered an infinite money glitch. He thought it would allow him to mint 4 times as many coins from the exact same amount of silver.
It was an act of sovereign fraud.
It was, and it provides a flawless textbook demonstration of a core economic principle known as Gresham's Law.
Gresham's Law.
Sir Thomas Gresham was an influential British financier who later analyzed the fallout of Henry's actions and articulated the behavioral phenomenon. Bad money drives out good.
Bad money drives out good.
Henry VIII assumed the public would simply accept the new, debased coins at the exact same purchasing power because the crown declared it so. But he fundamentally underestimated the rational self-interest of the populace.
Because the people weren't foolish. The silver wash would quickly rub off the high points of the new coins, revealing the dull copper underneath. The public instantly realized the new money was intrinsically worthless compared to the old money.
So put yourself in the position of a 16th century merchant. You have a purse containing 2 different coins. The king legally dictates that both are worth exactly 1 penny. However, you know for a fact that the older coin contains pure silver that you could melt down and sell abroad for a premium.
While the newly minted coin is essentially a copper token.
Right. When you go to the market to buy supplies, which coin do you hand over?
The bad one, obviously.
You hoard the older, pure silver coin. You bury it in your floorboards or you export it. You only ever spend the newly minted, debased copper coin.
So within a shockingly short time frame, all the good money is sucked out of circulation by individual hoarding.
And the only currency left flowing through the economy is the bad, debased money. Consequently, a massive crisis of trust occurs. Foreign merchants refuse to accept English coins, and domestic merchants drastically raise their prices to compensate for the fact that the money they are receiving is fundamentally degraded.
It triggered a devastating wave of inflation.
Yes.
And if Henry VIII's debasement was a localized crisis of manipulation, what the Spanish Empire did shortly after, beginning in the 1540s, was an accidental financial apocalypse on a global scale.
It was unprecedented.
The Spanish conquistadors discovered unimaginably vast deposits of raw silver in the mountains of Potosi, located in modern-day Bolivia. From roughly 1540 to 1640, the Spanish mobilized a brutal extraction operation, mining this silver and loading it onto galleons.
They were shipping an incomprehensible 350 tons of pure silver back across the Atlantic to Europe every single year for a century.
The Spanish crown believed they had permanently secured their position as the wealthiest, most dominant empire in human history. But they were operating under a fundamental, fatal misunderstanding of what wealth actually is.
They equated physical money, the silver itself, with wealth. But true wealth is the actual production of goods, services, infrastructure, and agricultural output.
So by flooding the European continent with a massive, unprecedented influx of silver, without a corresponding massive increase in the production of food, clothing, or housing, they inadvertently destroyed the purchasing power of the currency.
It is the ultimate lesson in the mechanics of the money supply. Because there was suddenly an ocean of silver circulating, but the exact same limited number of sheep, bushels of wheat, and skilled laborers.
The ratio completely collapsed.
The silver was chasing the same amount of goods. Therefore, the merchants simply demanded more silver for the exact same product. The price of basic necessities skyrocketed, resulting in what historians call the price revolution.
A century of crippling continent-wide inflation.
Inflation that destabilized governments, devastated the purchasing power of the working class, and eventually contributed to the bankruptcy of the Spanish crown itself, despite sitting on mountains of precious metal.
Intellectuals, philosophers, and merchants across Europe watched this unfold and realized that simplistic hoarding was dangerous. There were deep, invisible mechanisms dictating the rise and fall of nations.
They realized they urgently needed a formal framework to study how the supply of money dynamically interacts with wages, prices, and human behavior.
And out of the ashes of those massive historical blunders, the formal science of economics begins to take shape. Fast forward to the intellectual ferment of the 18th century. In 1776, a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith publishes a foundational text titled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations.
In it, he drops a conceptual bombshell that completely rewrites global policy.
The theory of the invisible hand.
Right. To understand why Smith's theory was so revolutionary, you have to understand the deeply entrenched ideology he was arguing against.
Which was mercantilism.
Exactly. The dominant economic doctrine of his era was mercantilism. It viewed global economics as a brutal, zero-sum game of warfare by other means. The prevailing belief was that the total amount of wealth in the world was fixed.
So if France got richer, England mathematically had to get poorer.
Precisely. The only way for a nation to secure power was to obsessively hoard gold and silver by maximizing exports, selling as much as possible to rival nations, while simultaneously erecting massive, prohibitive tariffs to block all imports.
Preventing any gold from leaving the country.
It was an ideology of strict government control, monopolies, and colonial extraction.
Smith steps into this highly paranoid, protectionist environment and says, you have the entire mechanism backward. Wealth is not a fixed pie of hoarded gold. Wealth is created through free trade, specialization, and competition.
He argued that the heavy hand of the state trying to micromanage trade actually stifles prosperity.
His concept of the invisible hand posits that these seemingly chaotic, selfish actions of individuals operating in a free market naturally and automatically guide the entire economy toward optimal prosperity and efficiency.
Smith famously observed that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest.
If a baker decides to act greedily and charge an outrageously high price for a loaf of bread, he might make a large profit for a few days.
But that very greed creates a powerful market signal. A rival baker down the street sees that high price, realizes they can sell their bread for slightly less, undercut the greedy baker, capture all the customers, and still turn a comfortable profit.
This fierce, self-interested competition relentlessly drives prices down and quality up until the market naturally settles at an equilibrium.
A fair price point where buyers are satisfied and sellers are earning enough to stay in business. Smith theorized that by simply allowing individuals to pursue their own profit motives, the system, as if guided by an invisible hand, allocates resources and meets the needs of society far more effectively than any king or central planning committee ever could.
It's an incredibly elegant, optimistic theory that formed the bedrock of free market capitalism. But as the Industrial Revolution exploded and the global economy became infinitely more complex, moving into the chaotic early 20th century, it became glaringly apparent that the invisible hand occasionally suffers from severe, devastating tremors.
Markets crash, monopolies form, and millions lose their jobs in localized panics.
This realization sparks the great clash of the economic titans. But before we dive into these conflicting theories, we need to clearly define the two distinct lenses through which modern economists view the world: macroeconomics versus microeconomics.
The distinction is vital because the scale dictates the tools you use. Macroeconomics is the study of the entire forest. It looks at the aggregated, sweeping metrics that define a national or global economy.
So a macroeconomist is analyzing the total money supply orchestrated by a central bank.
Right, tracking national unemployment rates, measuring the overall gross domestic product, and monitoring generalized inflation. They're looking at the massive tectonic plates of the system.
And microeconomics.
Conversely, it's the study of the individual trees within that forest. It zeroes in on the specific behavior of localized groups, individual consumers, and single corporate entities. A microeconomist studies how a sudden freeze in Florida affects the specific price of orange juice.
Or how a tech monopoly suppresses wages in a particular sector.
Or how an individual household alters its spending when a new local tax is introduced.
Okay, keeping that sweeping, macro perspective in mind, the global economy slams into the 1930s. The Great Depression devastates the industrialized world. Massive, persistent unemployment, collapsing industries, and a complete failure of the market to naturally correct itself.
The invisible hand seemed entirely paralyzed.
Economists were desperately battling over how to restart a frozen machine. The source material highlights the absolute heavy hitters of this era. Let's start with the man who redefined government intervention, John Maynard Keynes.
The context of the Great Depression is crucial here. Keynes looked at the devastation and realized that the classical economic assumption that markets will always naturally self-correct and return to full employment if you just leave them alone long enough was fatally flawed in the short term.
As he famously quipped, in the long run, we are all dead.
Exactly. In his monumental 1935 work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, Keynes argued that an economy could get trapped in a downward spiral of declining demand.
Right. If consumers are terrified of losing their jobs, they stop spending. Because they stop spending, businesses lose revenue. Because businesses lose revenue, they fire workers.
Those fired workers now have zero income, so they spend even less, accelerating the cycle. Keynes argued that the only entity massive enough to break this cycle is the national government.
His prescription was radical at the time. During a severe recession, the government must abandon the idea of a balanced budget. They must intentionally run a deficit by borrowing money and aggressively increasing government spending.
Build massive public infrastructure projects, construct dams, pave highways, build schools, and simultaneously cut taxes.
The goal is to artificially inject cash directly into the pockets of the working class. Those workers take that government paycheck and spend it at the local grocery store.
The grocer takes that revenue and orders more goods from the factories. The factories have to hire back the laid-off workers to meet the new orders.
It creates a powerful multiplier effect, artificially stimulating aggregate demand until the private sector engine catches fire and can run on its own again.
Keynes focuses on manipulating the demand side through sheer fiscal spending. But then we look at an American economist, Irving Fisher, who approaches the crisis from a completely different, highly mechanical angle.
Fisher was less concerned with government infrastructure projects and entirely focused on the actual volume of the currency itself.
He was a primary champion of the quantity theory of money. Fisher viewed the economy almost like a closed plumbing system.
He argued mathematically that there is a direct, mechanical, and unavoidable link between the total amount of money circulating within an economy and the general price level of the goods being sold.
His theory posited that if a central bank pumps a massive influx of new money into the supply, but the actual physical output of factories and farms remains exactly the same, the inevitable mathematical result is that prices will rise to absorb the new currency.
The sheer abundance of the money lowers its individual purchasing power.
Therefore, managing the health of the economy is primarily an exercise in strictly managing the flow of the money supply relative to economic output.
Standing in absolute ideological opposition to both the free market capitalists and the central planners is Karl Marx, who steps outside the mechanics of money entirely to question the very philosophical definition of value.
Marx provides a fundamental critique of the entire capitalist structure. He championed the labor theory of value.
In the classical market view, a diamond is wildly expensive and a bottle of water is incredibly cheap based entirely on subjective market demand and relative scarcity, despite water being necessary for life.
Marx argued this was an exploitative illusion. He posited that the true inherent economic value of any manufactured good should not be dictated by the chaotic, arbitrary whims of market demand or the manipulations of the money supply.
Instead, value is objectively determined strictly by the aggregate amount of human labor required to produce it.
If a simple wooden chair requires 5 hours of human labor to harvest the wood, mill it, and assemble it, while an intricate dining table requires 50 hours of skilled labor, the table inherently holds 10 times the economic value of the chair.
Marx argued that profit in a capitalist system is essentially the theft of the surplus value generated by the worker's labor, seized by the owner of the factory who did none of the physical work.
It is a radical reframing of human effort. But returning to the mechanics of the market, the mid to late 20th century saw a massive intellectual pushback against Keynesian government spending.
This brings us to the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and the American Milton Friedman, who advocated for a return to trusting the market, but with highly specific views on how to avoid the crashes.
Hayek was deeply skeptical of Keynesian intervention. He observed that the macroeconomy naturally breathes in and out. It experiences an organic business cycle of expansions and contractions.
Hayek vehemently warned against governments or central banks trying to artificially smooth out this cycle by pumping cheap credit and low-interest loans into the system during a mild recession.
He argued that artificially cheap money distorts the signals of the free market, encouraging businesses to make massive, unsustainable investments, malinvestments that they otherwise wouldn't make.
This creates an artificial boom, a massive bubble, which inevitably leads to a much more devastating catastrophic crash when reality sets in.
Milton Friedman built upon these concepts to form the school of monetarism. Friedman heavily criticized the massive bureaucratic government spending programs advocated by Keynes, arguing they were inefficient, politically motivated, and prone to causing long-term inflation.
Friedman believed the government's role should be strictly limited. Instead of the government building bridges to create jobs, the independent central bank should quietly manage the economy solely by manipulating interest rates to control the money supply.
If the economy is freezing up, lower interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, naturally stimulating private business investment. If the economy is overheating and inflation is rising, raise interest rates to restrict borrowing and cool the system down.
Just maintain a steady, predictable hand on the monetary faucet and let the private market do the actual work of creating wealth.
It is genuinely fascinating to trace how these Massive, sweeping macro theories, debated in academic halls, dictate the daily reality, employment status, and purchasing power of billions of people.
But I want to execute a hard pivot now. I want to zoom in utilizing that microeconomic lens. We are moving from the sweeping monetary theories of sovereign nations down into the granular tactical reality of the modern megacorporation.
We are pulling back the corporate curtain.
Because how businesses actually utilize, hoard, and report their money today is an entirely different operational beast. And there is a fundamental lesson here for anyone looking at a stock portfolio or trying to understand business. Do not ever be fooled when a company's PR department aggressively brags about their total revenue.
Falling for the revenue trap is the most common mistake made by novice investors or the general public when assessing corporate strength. Revenue is merely the top line of the income statement.
It represents the gross aggregate amount of cash that simply walked through the front door as a result of sales during a specific period.
But a massive revenue number tells you absolutely nothing about the underlying structural health of the business. To understand true profitability, sustainability, and efficiency, you have to bypass the top line and aggressively interrogate the net income.
Let's clearly define the mechanics of this calculation. Net income is your total revenue, aggressively stripped down by subtracting every conceivable cost of doing business. And those operational costs are brutal and extensive.
From your massive revenue pile, you must first subtract the direct cost of the raw materials required to manufacture your product.
Then you subtract the entire payroll, wages, benefits, pensions.
Then you subtract corporate taxes owed to the government. Then you subtract the relentless, everyday operational expenses, commercial rent, massive utility bills, marketing budgets, insurance premiums.
Then you subtract the calculated depreciation of your physical assets. And finally, you subtract the banking fees and the interest charges required to service your corporate debt.
Whatever minuscule pile of cash is left sitting on the table at the very, very bottom of that exhaustive calculation is your net income. It is the literal mathematical bottom line.
And when you apply that rigorous calculation to the apex predators of the modern corporate ecosystem, the sheer scale of the wealth generated becomes incredibly difficult to fully comprehend.
The source material provides a highly specific, staggering data point to illustrate this. Let's look at Apple Inc. in April of 2016.
At that specific moment in time, Apple was sitting on a mountain of $216 billion in absolute cash reserves. They weren't investing it, it was just sitting there, highly liquid.
To frame the gravity of that number, all non-financial companies in the entire United States combined held roughly $1.7 trillion in cash at that time.
Apple, a single tech company, held a massive, disproportionate percentage of the entire nation's corporate liquidity.
And looking at their performance in just the first quarter of 2016, Apple generated a net income, not gross revenue, but pure, unadulterated profit after every single one of those massive global expenses, taxes, and salaries were paid of $18.4 billion in 3 months.
At the time, it was the single highest quarterly profit recorded in corporate history. They were generating the GDP of a small nation state every 90 days.
It is a profound concentration of capital. However, it is vital to remember that Apple is an extreme, anomalous outlier.
For the vast, overwhelming majority of businesses operating in the real world, particularly early-stage startups and mid-sized enterprises, simply generating a healthy net income on a spreadsheet is not enough to guarantee survival.
And this introduces the single most critical, often misunderstood operational metric, cash flow.
The statistics surrounding business survival are incredibly grim. Roughly 80% of small business startups ultimately fail. And the tragedy is that they rarely fail because the founder had a terrible idea or because there was no market demand for the product.
They fail mathematically due to poor cash flow management.
This is the invisible killer that annihilates brilliant entrepreneurs. The distinction between profit and cash flow is the difference between a map and the actual terrain.
A business can be incredibly, wildly profitable on an annualized accounting spreadsheet. Your calculated net income looks fantastic, investors are thrilled, and sales are through the roof.
But your company can still suffer a catastrophic bankruptcy if the chronological timing of the physical cash moving in and out of your bank accounts is misaligned.
Cash flow is entirely about the velocity and the timing of liquidity. If the physical cash flowing out of your business, your absolute obligations like paying commercial rent, meeting the biweekly payroll for your staff, and settling accounts with your aggressive raw material suppliers needs to happen faster than the physical cash flowing in from your clients paying their bills, you are caught in a lethal terminal trap.
The source highlights a specific, incredibly frustrating phenomenon known as insolvency by overtrading.
It happens when a company is actually too successful too quickly.
Imagine you run a manufacturing startup. You suddenly land a massive multi-million-dollar contract with a national retailer. To fulfill this massive order, you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars immediately.
You hire new staff, you run the factory 24/7, you buy tons of raw materials, and you successfully ship the product on time.
Your revenue on paper is millions. Your profit margin is fantastic. But the massive national retailer dictates the terms, and their contract states they have 90 days to actually pay your invoice.
Meanwhile, your factory workers demand their paychecks on Friday. The supplier demands payment for the raw materials in 30 days.
You have entirely drained your bank account to build the product, and the millions you are owed won't arrive for 3 months. Despite being highly profitable and owed millions, your bank account hits zero. You cannot make payroll.
You are technically insolvent, and the business collapses under the weight of its own success.
It is a heartbreaking scenario, and it is entirely common. The source meticulously breaks down the 5 primary cash flow bottlenecks that systematically kill operational businesses. Problem number 1, as highlighted in your scenario, is the slow payment of invoices by clients utilizing their leverage to delay parting with their own cash.
Problem number 2 is a structural gap in credit terms. This is a classic, entirely avoidable managerial trap. If a founder agrees to strict terms requiring them to pay their raw material suppliers within 30 days, but simultaneously negotiates weak contracts allowing their own customers 60 or 120 days to pay, they have engineered a permanent mathematical cash flow desert that they must miraculously survive every single month.
Problem 3 is a straightforward macroeconomic decline in sales, driven by an unforeseen recession or the sudden emergence of an aggressive competitor, leaving you with massive fixed overhead costs but dwindling daily cash receipts.
Problem 4 is the strategic underpricing of products. This is incredibly prevalent in the modern venture capital tech ecosystem. Startups will intentionally sell their product or service at a massive loss simply to acquire users and dominate market share, hoping to raise prices later.
They intentionally bleed cash every single day, requiring constant influxes of investor money just to survive the strategy.
And problem 5 is excessive overhead outlays. This is the classic mistake of a founder wanting to look successful, immediately signing a lease on a massive, expensive office space, or utilizing precious liquid cash to purchase heavy machinery outright, rather than simply renting the equipment and preserving the capital buffer.
And managing those massive operational outlays provides the perfect transition into the deeply strategic, highly complex world of corporate accounting. Because logging those expenses is not a simple exercise in basic arithmetic. It is a highly regulated, deeply strategic game of perception and tax management.
This brings us to the architecture of the balance sheet. If you are operating a complex corporation, you do not simply dump every single check you write into one giant expenses bucket.
The tax code forces management to make a highly strategic, foundational classification choice every time money leaves the building. Are you going to expense this specific cost immediately, or are you going to capitalize it over time?
Our source material provides a brilliantly clear analogy of a large operational ski resort to illuminate how this mechanism functions in reality.
The ski resort analogy perfectly isolates the different natures of corporate spending. Let's examine the concept of expensing first. Throughout the operating season, the resort is constantly burning cash.
They are purchasing bulk ingredients for the kitchens in the main chalet, they are paying the biweekly wages of the ski instructors and the lift operators, and they are paying the massive monthly electricity bills to keep the lights on and the snow machines running.
These are immediate, strictly operational, ongoing costs of doing business. Under accounting rules, these must be recorded on the income statement as an expense in the exact same financial year that the cash was spent.
And the strategic result of logging all those immediate expenses is that it drastically lowers your officially reported net profit for that specific year.
While Wall Street might prefer high profits, the corporate tax department loves lower profits, because a lower reported profit directly translates to a lower corporate tax bill owed to the government.
But what happens when the resort decides to execute a massive structural upgrade?
That is precisely where the strategy of capitalizing is deployed. Imagine the resort management decides to invest $5 million to purchase a fleet of massive new snowplows, construct a state-of-the-art high-speed chairlift, and buy a fleet of luxury passenger buses to shuttle guests from the airport.
These are not consumable items like hamburger buns or electricity. These are major structural assets that will provide tangible economic value and generate revenue for the business for a decade or more.
Therefore, accounting rules allow and often require that you do not take that massive $5 million financial hit all at once on your profit and loss statement in year one.
If you did, it would completely wipe out your profit, making the company look like a failing enterprise to investors, despite making a smart long-term infrastructure investment.
Instead, you capitalize the massive outlay. You formally record the new ski lift and the snowplows on the balance sheet as assets, increasing the overall paper value of your company.
You then systematically spread the actual cost of those assets out over the next 10 or 20 years. This is a brilliant, entirely legal mechanism because it dramatically smooths out the financial hit.
It matches the cost of the asset with the revenue it generates over its lifespan, making your short-term profitability look much healthier and more stable to outside investors examining your quarterly reports.
However, the immutable law of the physical universe is that a snowplow does not last forever. It endures brutal weather, mechanical wear and tear, and eventual obsolescence.
Therefore, the accounting world has engineered three highly specific, formalized methods to mathematically record how an asset slowly loses its value over time, allowing the company to continually write off a portion of that lost value to incrementally reduce their taxable profit year after year.
The most common method is depreciation, which is applied strictly to tangible physical assets that you can touch.
We all inherently understand the brutal reality of depreciation. The source points out the well-known consumer statistic that the average new car loses roughly 60% of its total value after just 3 years of driving it off the lot.
Well, a massive fleet of corporate delivery vans experiences the exact same degradation on the corporate books. So if a logistics company purchases a new van for $25,000, they do not expense the $25,000 immediately.
Instead, they might utilize a straight-line depreciation schedule, mathematically degrading the value of the van by $5,000 a year over a 5-year lifespan, slowly and predictably writing that fractional cost off against their income each year until the van is considered financially worthless.
The second method operates on the exact same underlying logic, but applies to a completely different class of asset: amortization. This is the process of incrementally spreading out the cost of intangible assets, things that hold massive financial value but lack a physical form.
For instance, if a major technology conglomerate spends $50 million to acquire the exclusive patent rights for a revolutionary new microchip design, they cannot physically touch the patent, but it is a massive asset.
They will amortize that $50 million cost, gradually writing it off their taxes over the legally protected lifespan of the patent, recognizing that the exclusive value of the design diminishes as competitors eventually catch up.
And the third distinct method is depletion, which is uniquely reserved for industries extracting natural resources from the earth. Imagine a massive timber corporation purchases a sprawling tract of forest land.
They know mathematically that the land contains a finite, measurable number of mature trees. As their crews systematically chop down those trees and extract the raw wood pulp over the span of a decade, the company utilizes the depletion method to incrementally record the falling, irreversible value of that specific tract of land on their balance sheet, matching the tax write-off directly to the physical extraction of the resource.
It is crucial to understand that expensing, capitalizing, depreciation, amortization, and depletion are entirely legal, standardized, and necessary accounting practices. They are designed to allow management to construct a mathematically accurate reflection of the complex declining value of massive corporate assets over time.
However, these methods require subjective judgment. Management must estimate the lifespan of an asset. And the moment subjective judgment enters the equation, it opens the door for executives to start getting overly creative.
When management begins manipulating these legal frameworks to intentionally paint a false, overly optimistic picture for investors, we cross the threshold into highly dangerous territory.
We are crossing into the dark arts of corporate accounting. To understand why executives risk prison to manipulate spreadsheets, you have to understand the core psychology driving the modern stock market.
Institutional investors, pension fund managers, and Wall Street analysts possess a deep, structural hatred for volatility. They despise surprises. They do not want to see a company report a staggering, record-breaking profit one year, followed by a massive, terrifying loss the next, even if that accurately reflects the chaotic reality of their specific industry.
Wall Street demands steady, predictable, boring, relentless upward growth quarter after quarter, year after year.
And corporate executives, whose massive multi-million-dollar compensation packages and stock options are entirely tied to maintaining that steadily rising stock price, are acutely aware of this demand. Therefore, they engage in a highly controversial borderline practice known as smoothing earnings.
The objective is to utilize the flexibility of accounting rules to artificially dampen the natural, chaotic fluctuations in reported profit. Imagine a corporation experiences an incredibly lucrative boom year, sales exceed all expectations, and profits are massive.
Instead of transparently reporting all of that profit to the public, which would set an impossibly high expectation for the following year, management might utilize legal loopholes to quietly hide a large chunk of that profit away.
They might artificially inflate their estimated future costs and stash the cash on the balance sheet categorized as a provision for future expenses.
It is essentially constructing a secret, massive, corporate rainy day fund hidden in the footnotes of the accounting ledger.
Precisely. Fast forward 3 years. The economy cools down, the company hits a severe operational slump, and true profits plummet. To avoid terrifying their investors and crashing the stock price, management simply dips into that hidden provision.
They quietly release the stashed cash back onto the active income statement, artificially boosting the reported profit for that bad year. From the outside, looking at the smoothed-out graph, it appears as though the company is a perfectly managed machine that never experiences a slump.
Jack Welch, the legendary and highly aggressive former CEO of General Electric, essentially admitted to this overarching philosophy, famously stating, "We're not managing profits, we're managing businesses." The implication is that shaping the perception of stability is a core function of executive management.
It sounds incredibly pragmatic from a leadership perspective, smoothing out the rough edges to protect the shareholders. But it is a notoriously slippery slope. Because when the intense pressure to smooth earnings and hide structural losses crosses the line from aggressive gray area accounting into outright malicious fabrication, you witness the detonation of the most destructive financial scandals in modern history.
The source material highlights the absolute worst offenders, and examining their specific mechanics is terrifying. Let's look at the collapse of Enron in 2001.
Enron is the gold standard of corporate illusion. At its peak, it was celebrated as one of the top 7 largest and most innovative companies in the United States, dominating the energy sector. But the entire corporate structure was a hollow house of cards.
The executives utilized incredibly complex, opaque accounting loopholes to create thousands of off-balance sheet special-purpose entities. Whenever an Enron project failed and generated massive debt, instead of reporting that loss on the main corporate ledger, they would quietly transfer the toxic debt into these hidden shell companies.
To the public, Enron's main balance sheet looked wildly profitable and pristine, driving the stock price to record highs. But in reality, they were functionally insolvent, drowning in hidden liabilities.
When the complex web finally unraveled and the company abruptly filed for bankruptcy, the stock went to zero and shareholders, including the pension funds of their own employees, lost a combined devastating $74 billion.
$74 billion evaporated because of accounting tricks. And then you look at WorldCom in 2006, a massive telecommunications giant. Their fraud wasn't even as complex as Enron's hidden shell companies. It was just a brazen manipulation of the very expensing and capitalizing rules we just discussed.
When their operational costs started skyrocketing, instead of properly logging those massive line costs as immediate expenses, which would have revealed massive losses, the CEO directed the accounting department to fraudulently reclassify billions of dollars of basic expenses as long-term capital investments.
By illegally capitalizing basic expenses, they artificially inflated the value of their corporate assets by a staggering $11 billion, faking profitability for years until the internal auditors finally blew the whistle.
The magnitude of these frauds demonstrates how a few altered lines on a spreadsheet can annihilate tens of thousands of jobs, and the ripples can easily escape a single company and collapse the entire global economy. Look at the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the fall of 2008.
Lehman was a titan of Wall Street, a venerable investment bank founded before the Civil War in 1850. But in the years leading up to the crash, they had heavily leveraged themselves, aggressively buying up billions in incredibly toxic, high-risk, subprime mortgages.
When the housing market began to turn, Lehman knew they were holding essentially worthless paper. To maintain the illusion of strength, they utilized an accounting gimmick known as Repo 105. At the very end of every financial quarter, right before they had to publish their balance sheet to the public, they would temporarily transfer these toxic assets off their books to another bank in exchange for cash.
They published the report showing they had high cash reserves and low risk. Days later, they would quietly buy the toxic assets back. They were intentionally hiding roughly $50 billion of highly leveraged, worthless assets from the public.
When the music finally stopped and other banks refused to lend to them, the 158-year-old institution collapsed overnight, serving as a primary catalyst that triggered the worst global financial crisis since the Great Depression.
And it is impossible to discuss the destruction of 2008 without examining the actions of Bernie Madoff. Madoff bypassed complex corporate accounting entirely and orchestrated the ultimate primitive Ponzi scheme on an unprecedented scale.
He ran a highly exclusive investment advisory business. He promised his wealthy clients exactly what we discussed earlier: perfectly smooth, predictable, consistent returns, regardless of what the broader stock market was doing. He delivered flawless statements every month showing steady profits.
The horrifying reality was that he wasn't investing their money at all. He wasn't buying stocks or bonds. He was simply taking the massive influx of cash from new investors and quietly using it to pay the fabricated returns of the older investors.
It was an illusion of smoothing without any underlying economic engine. When the crash hit, his clients panicked and collectively attempted to withdraw billions of dollars in cash all at once. The entire facade instantly evaporated, revealing that the vault was completely empty. Investors, charities, and universities lost an estimated $65 billion.
Madoff is the terminal endpoint of valuing the appearance of stability over the reality of the math. The source material includes a highly relevant quote from legendary investor Warren Buffett that perfectly encapsulates the supreme danger of executives playing these games. Buffett warned, "Stressing accounting appearance over economic substance achieves neither."
If a management team expends all their energy merely shifting numbers around the ledger to artificially manufacture the appearance of smooth growth while ignoring the actual substance of building a sustainable product, the underlying economic reality will eventually, inevitably, catch up to them. And when the illusion breaks, the resulting destruction is absolute.
So if you are an analyst, an investor, or simply an entrepreneur attempting to understand how a legitimate business actually finances its survival and expansion without resorting to fraudulent illusions, you must look far beyond the raw, easily manipulated profit numbers. You have to aggressively interrogate the balance sheet to assess exactly how much foundational risk the company is carrying.
And that brings us to the final critical metric: gearing ratios and corporate risk. Let me pose a highly practical scenario to you. Let's say you have founded a successful mid-sized manufacturing company and you want to execute a massive multi-million-dollar expansion to build a new factory.
You eventually have two distinct paths to acquire that massive amount of capital. You can sell new shares of your company to venture capitalists or the public market, which is equity funding, or you can walk into a major commercial bank and take out a massive interest-bearing loan, which is debt funding.
The precise mathematical balance between how much of the company is funded by the owner's actual capital, its equity, and how much it relies on borrowed external money, its debt, is formally known as the gearing ratio, or financial leverage. Outside of basic cash flow, it is arguably the single most important metric financial analysts scrutinize to assess how structurally vulnerable or risky a company actually is when an economic storm hits.
Let's flatten the math and look at a concrete example to understand how this ratio is calculated. The formula compares long-term debt to the total capital of the business. Let's put real simple numbers to this. Imagine your business has taken out $25,000 in long-term bank loans. At the same time, you and your partners have invested $75,000 of your own cash into the business, which is your equity.
Therefore, the total capital actively running the business is $100,000. Because your borrowed debt is $25,000 out of that $100,000 total pool, your gearing ratio is exactly 25%. Generally speaking, in traditional finance, a company is considered structurally safe or operating with low gearing if that specific ratio sits at 25% or lower.
The logic behind that 25% safety threshold is purely defensive. If the ratio is low, it indicates the enterprise is overwhelmingly funded by its own committed equity, not by the bank's money. If a sudden brutal economic downturn hits, or a new competitor steals half their market share, their revenues will drop. But they do not have a massive, inflexible, multi-million-dollar monthly interest payment hanging around their neck that the bank will demand, regardless of the economy.
They have the financial slack and the flexibility to weather the storm without being dragged into immediate bankruptcy proceedings.
But looking deeper at the data raises a fascinating counterintuitive question. Is high debt universally bad? Is a company carrying a massive 60% gearing ratio automatically a terrible, highly dangerous investment that should be avoided at all costs?
Absolutely not. And that is where deep industry context matters immensely. You simply cannot assess a high-growth tech startup and a 100-year-old railway company using the exact same baseline assumptions. The source material provides two brilliant contrasting examples to illustrate why high debt is sometimes perfectly acceptable. First, imagine a rapidly growing software company that is preparing to go public. The analysts calculate their gearing ratio, and it sits at a very low 21.2%.
The institutional investors absolutely love this low number. Why? Because the underlying technology market is inherently chaotic and incredibly volatile. Software products become obsolete in months, new disruptors emerge daily, and consumer loyalty is low. Because the operational environment is so highly risky, investors demand that the financial balance sheet be as safe and debt-free as possible.
It makes perfect sense. But then look at the completely opposite example provided in the source. A massive regional water utility company. An analyst examines their books and discovers they are operating with a staggering gearing ratio of 64%. By traditional baseline metrics, they are dangerously overleveraged, absolutely swimming in long-term corporate debt. But the institutional investors are perfectly content and the stock is highly stable. Why?
Because context is everything. The water utility is a government-sanctioned regional monopoly. They provide a vital, non-negotiable resource to millions of residential customers who have literally no alternative option but to pay their water bill in full every single month. Their incoming cash flow is virtually guaranteed, incredibly stable, and highly predictable for decades into the future. Because their revenue is a certainty, they can easily and safely afford to make the massive, ongoing interest payments required to service that 64% debt load without breaking a sweat.
Exactly. Corporate finance is never a binary choice between good and bad. It is a constant strategic evaluation of the pros and cons of utilizing debt versus equity, heavily dictated by the specific stability of your business model. Taking on massive bank debt has distinct, highly attractive advantages for a founder. If you fund your new factory strictly with a loan, you are not diluting your ownership. You maintain 100% of the equity, you do not have to surrender a board seat or give up strategic control to aggressive angel investors, and the massive interest payments you make to the bank are typically entirely tax deductible, lowering your corporate tax burden.
Furthermore, once that loan is finally paid off in 10 years, you retain absolute ownership of all future profits generated by that factory. But the existential danger of debt is the threat of becoming overleveraged. A bank loan is ruthless. If your newly built factory faces a union strike or your main client goes bankrupt, the commercial bank does not care about your operational problems. They legally demand their monthly payment. If you miss it, they will seize the assets and force you into insolvency.
Equity funding, on the other hand, provides a powerful safety net. You sell shares of your company to a venture capital firm. You receive millions in liquid cash, and crucially, you do not have to repay it. There are no monthly interest payments draining your cash flow. If the entire company fails and goes to zero, the wealthy shareholders absorb the financial loss alongside you. They cannot seize your house. Additionally, top-tier angel investors often bring massive operational expertise, vital industry connections, and strategic guidance to help the startup rapidly scale.
But the permanent, unavoidable trade-off for that safety net is extreme dilution. By selling equity to survive, you are literally carving up and giving away permanent pieces of your company. You are permanently surrendering a percentage of all future profits until the end of time. And more importantly, you take on a strict fiduciary and legal obligation to act in the financial interests of those new outside shareholders. They now possess voting rights and have a direct say in how you run your daily operations. The life of a CEO is a constant, agonizing balancing act between aggressively utilizing debt to maintain absolute control while increasing insolvency risk versus utilizing equity to ensure survival while slowly giving the company away.
We have covered an absolutely staggering amount of conceptual and historical ground today. We set out to comprehensively map the DNA of money, and we have traced the entire evolutionary arc.
We started by examining ancient human beings struggling with the friction of bartering cows for wheat, leading to the invention of the IOU. We witnessed the physical evolution of trust, moving from ancient cowrie shells and baked clay cuneiform tablets to the Lydians stamping the first gold coins.
We saw the scientific genius of Isaac Newton redesigning the milling on British coins to fight counterfeiting and preserve trust, right up to the grand societal leap of faith required to accept paper banknotes in 1661.
We examined the catastrophic fallout of misunderstanding money, from Henry VIII's great debasement to the Spanish Empire triggering a century of inflation with Potosi silver, ultimately forcing Adam Smith to introduce the revolutionary concept of the invisible hand.
We tracked how those massive macroeconomic theories evolved through the crucible of the Great Depression, leading to the massive intellectual clashes between Keynes advocating for heavy government spending, Fisher focusing on the plumbing of the money supply, Marx questioning the very definition of value, and Friedman arguing for strict central bank management.
We then forcefully pulled back the curtain on the modern microeconomy, looking past the illusion of top-line corporate revenue to understand the brutal daily reality of cash flow and insolvency by overtrading. We decoded the strategic art of the balance sheet, exploring how companies legally utilize expensing, capitalizing, and complex depreciation schedules to manage their tax burden.
We explored the deeply psychological temptation of smoothing earnings and how the obsession with predictable growth leads to catastrophic, system-breaking frauds like Enron, WorldCom, and the Ponzi scheme of Bernie Madoff. And finally, we analyzed the high-stakes tightrope walk of corporate risk, balancing the gearing ratio between the control of debt and the safety of equity dilution.
It has been a massive, wild intellectual journey. But before we officially wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over. Our source materials highlighted several historical milestones that feel strangely, almost uncomfortably modern.
For instance, the data shows that the core concept of crowdfunding, many individuals pooling small amounts of capital to fund a venture, has actually been a documented practice since the 1700s.
We established that the issuance of paper banknotes began in 1661. These concepts are ancient. But we also examined the staggering, disruptive realities of the modern era. 2.5 billion adults operating today are entirely unbanked, surviving entirely outside the complex, highly regulated traditional system we just spent an hour dissecting.
Simultaneously, 92% of all global currency circulating right now is entirely digital, existing only as database entries. And the rise of cryptography has introduced assets like Bitcoin, which had already reached 16 billion circulating coins by 2016, allowing individuals to securely transfer massive value while completely bypassing traditional commercial and central banks entirely.
So, synthesizing thousands of years of history with the bleeding edge of modern data, here is the fundamental question for you to ponder. We have exhaustively established that money, stripped of its physical form, is ultimately just a deeply ingrained, agreed-upon illusion. It is simply a psychological ledger of mutual trust.
If modern technology now possesses the capability to securely store, verify, and instantly transfer that required trust entirely peer-to-peer across a decentralized, cryptographically secure digital network without requiring a centralized institution to act as the middleman, are we actively watching the slow, inevitable extinction of the traditional banking system?
When you project these trends forward in a few generations, will the concept of walking into a physical, marble-columned bank branch, or the idea of a central government issuing a physical paper dollar, seem just as ancient, just as cumbersome, and just as totally, inherently absurd as dragging a 3.75-ton rye stone down the street to buy your groceries?
It suggests we are on the precipice of a profound structural shift in the very nature and architecture of human trust.
Something to chew on the next time you casually tap your phone against a piece of plastic to pay for a cup of coffee. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into how money works. Keep actively questioning the massive, complex systems operating invisibly around you every single day.